Welcome to the Science of Parenting podcast, where we connect you with research-based information that fits your family. I'm Lori Cordles, parent of 3 in 2 different life stages. 2 are launched and 1 is still in high school, and I'm a parenting educator.
And I'm Mackenzie Johnson, parent of 2 littles with their own quirks, and I'm a parenting educator. Today, we'll talk about the realities of raising a family and how research can help guide our parenting decisions. Hey, everybody, we're back. I almost said season 2. Season 8,
Season 8,
episode 2.
Episode 2.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. It does feel
Welcome.
weird. I don't know how to start.
I don't either.
I only know how to say the beginning.
I know,
That's it.
yes. So
But
I'll
then the
just
joke
dive right in, right? Okay,
Yeah.
you heard some stuff from us already, so here we are,
Yes.
like live. Okay, so and we are in the great guidance and discipline debate. I feel like we need a rim shot. Dun, dun.
Like,
Ta-da. So we're going to take a look at this topic of guiding our children from multiple perspectives this season. And we are really looking at this idea of there are so many ways to guide and develop and shape and
Yes.
mold our children that there's just not just one right way, right? We say that, right? There's more than one
way.
great way, more than one way to raise great kids.
There we go.
So many words. But what we're using this season is the book. We're actually using a book called The Handbook of Parenting. Yep, there is such a thing.
Real.
Volume 5, okay, and it's edited by Mark Bornstein. And that's what we're using this whole season to really look at all of these ways to guide and shape our children. The great guidance and discipline debate. That's what it is.
Yes. And so we're using that chapter by Dr. Jennifer Lansford focused on child discipline so that we are citing a lot this week. Well, every week. We're citing a lot every week. Yes. And last week, we gave kind of our general introduction of like, what are we talking about when we're talking about
Talking about
what we talk about when we are talking about guidance and discipline. And that idea of really we're defining it as shaping behavior. And Barb gave us such a good reminder after we recorded last week. She's like, yeah, you're shaping behavior the kind you want them to have as adults. Like we're shaping their behavior of who they're going to be out in the world. It was like, yeah, we should have said that.
We should have said that. Write it down so we say it next week.
Right. Yeah, let's say it next time.
Yes.
But so yeah, last week we really defined it and we looked at those categories, right? Different categories that discipline behaviors fall into. And we're just going to keep on rolling with it.
We are. And really what we want to remember also is that some of these things are going to be tough for us as parents to recognize, especially this week. But really what we want is to share that positive spin with you on, you know what? This is the reality of parenting, but there's hope. There's hope.
Yes.
Every day.
Yes. And so this week we're looking at, we're calling this episode the unspoken aspects. So like, what are those things that influence us that we maybe don't even realize related to how we interact and discipline our kids? So yeah, this unspoken.
Yes. All right. So tell us a little bit about some of the research. How about that?
Yes. So Lansford tells us that individual characteristics of both our kids and us as parents are going to predict the kinds of discipline that we use. And that sounds like, okay, sure. No, but that's actually a big deal.
It is.
It's not, so often it's like, well, if parents would just. How many times have we said that before? Or heard it said. But that really, who our child is, the way they behave, and these factors we're going to walk through in a second, they influence how we discipline as well. Like there are certain traits that increase our likelihood of being harsher, traits that we might define as more difficult. And so, Lori, walk us through, let's break down. We'll do child and then we'll look at the parent traits. But what are some of these traits that make us more likely to be harsh with our children?
Absolutely. So again, remember that some of these, like we're gonna feel, like we might feel a pinch or a poke or a sting, and that's okay because recognizing what we do and don't want to do when it comes to parenting is super important. So hang with us. So sometimes we have things that children are experiencing, like conduct problems or attention problems, or they're not being compliant, and that really impacts which discipline tool we pull out of our parenting toolbox. We also know that sometimes when it comes to temperament, children have more negative mood, just as parents do, right? Some of their
Mhm.
temperaments are more spirited. Other times we might use the word more difficult. And we know that those specific temperaments, they take more parenting energy. Right?
Yeah.
They just do. So those more
Yes.
spirited temperaments just take more. We
Mhm.
also know that some children exhibit behaviors that are particularly stressful for parents.
Yes.
For some parents, more than others, for particular parents over other parents. It's just the child's behavior that's creating the stress. Might not bother me, but it might totally bother Mackenzie.
Yeah.
And then the
That's
last
possible.
aspect is
That is possible.
the last aspect is if a child has a disability or a diverse ability, you
Mhm.
know what? Sometimes those really impact which parenting tool we grab. And oftentimes, if a child has difficulty with communication, that again takes more parenting energy and really can impact if we use harsh discipline, harsh punishment or not. So,
Mhm.
those things they impact and are more likely to see parents using harsher punishment.
Yes. The literature, like the research in the book, talked about these traits and like these kids are more likely to experience I mean even like abuse, more likely
Mhm.
to experience harsh punishment and there's a spectrum of discipline and that is just they're just more likely to. And so as parents, real talk for a second, right? Like okay, yes, this is uncomfortable to hear, but I think it can also be an aha moment of
Mhm.
wait, this might be why I feel I have a harder time parenting this child than I do their sibling. And it's
Exactly.
not because there's something wrong with me or that like
Mm-mm.
that one's my favorite or it might be
Yes.
that their temperament or their abilities or their general behaviors align more easily with your natural parenting style versus
Mhm.
the other ones might require more.
Mhm.
And so, as you look at that list, what hits home for you as a parent? Like, what are the traits that maybe are there that you're like, "You know what? This is a factor."
I definitely can pinpoint, especially early on,
Mhm.
in my parenting when I didn't know that my child had a
Mm.
diagnosable disability,
Yes.
and there was specific disability with her communication, and so there were times that I knew that I was being more harsh than
Mhm.
I wanted to be. I was
Yes.
overwhelmed and stressed, and the impact of her disability was really, making me choose different types of parenting tools that I really wasn't using with my
Yes.
other child at that time, and I
Yes.
would become frustrated with myself because of it.
Yes. Well, and yeah, it required different things of you.
It did, and the things
Yes.
I had used previously weren't working, and I didn't
Yes, which is
understand
frustrating.
why. That is frustrating. It
Yes.
is.
Yes. Well, and so they talk about behaviors that are particularly stressful for the parent. So, like, in my specific situation, I have anxiety, and
Mhm.
so which is actually something I've learned about throughout our podcasting. I've been on this journey of learning more about it, but it can make me very prone to being irritable and getting overstimulated very easily.
Mm.
And as I said before, I have very lovely, loud children. They're loud. Um, they're loud, as am
Ah.
I. I know exactly where they get it. But so sometimes the behaviors like the whining, yelling, crying,
Mhm.
and even like happy yelling, like,
Yes.
that sometimes those things are really stressful for me and it's really hard for me to be clear-headed. I
Mm.
mean, total honestly, last night we were getting ready like to get supper together. We were eating like leftovers, so we were all just like we're heating up this and that, pulling out of the fridge, whatever. My kids are screaming about the plates that they
Uh.
have. Like they're fighting over, I don't want that one. And then my husband's trying to ask me, like, what are we heating up next? What are we? And it was just a lot. And then yeah, my kids are just yelling, like, Mom, we did it. And I yelled the word stop. Like I was like,
Mhm.
stop. Everybody just like looked at me. I was like,
Aw.
I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah.
But I also needed us to stop.
Yes.
Um, but it was short, it was barky because that particular behavior
Mhm.
is a lot, and I was overstimulated, And so
Yeah,
there's certain behaviors for our each, unique situation we have as parents that come out as a factor.
we do. Yeah. And we have this default, like this factory reset. Okay. So
Yes.
we engage that factory reset on times when we're stressed, when we're overwhelmed. And so
Yeah.
it's so important for us to like recognize, have an aha moment. Oh, factory reset is coming. And where does that factory reset come from? Okay, well, we're going to talk
Ooh,
about that next, right?
yes,
I led us
yes.
right into that, didn't I?
You
Right.
sure
All right.
did.
So we're going to kind of own up to what parents bring into this right now. And
Yes.
this is a hard one. If we have to really take a look at our own factory reset, we do have certain traits that make us more likely to use harsh punishment. Just based on the things that we know that we grew up with that are in our history. So we're going to just take these one at a time,
Yes.
and look at them, and just as a place to go, okay, that's where it comes from. Okay. And
Yes.
and do I want that factory reset to come into play less often, and how can I make that happen?
Absolutely.
All right,
And
you go
so,
first.
yeah, I would say the first one is if what kind of discipline we experience as kids.
Mhm,
Like, when we were children, the kind of discipline, if we did experience corporal punishment, it increases our likelihood of using it with our kids.
mhm,
And interesting in my, like in my partnership with my husband, one of us experienced corporal punishment and one of us didn't. And I remember before we had kids talking about how we would approach that. But yes, if we experience that, you're exactly right, Lori, those default settings that we
mhm,
talked about last week, that if I'm not careful, I will default to yelling like I
mhm,
did last night, right?
mhm.
If I am not intentional in that reflection, I have a higher likelihood that those are my default settings because
Mhm.
that's the way I was raised,
Yeah.
right? And so yelling stop was like, yes, of course, I can't think. I'm going to yell.
And I know I definitely went to my default settings
Mhm.
more because of my child's disability when I was frustrated with that. It was
Yes.
so much it was so much quicker to use that default setting of, stop that or just be frustrated. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, then another one, and this one is a little the description of it's technical, but basically that when parents have a bias, they call it hostile attributions.
Ooh. Ooh, that
Yeah.
sounds heavy.
Hostile attributions in ambiguous situations is technically what it said.
Ah!
Basically, right? I know I said it fast, so it's I don't know, that made it worse probably. Um, but it's this idea that if we have a high bias to assume that someone else's behavior is intentionally mean, malicious, naughty.
Okay. They
So
just
if
push
what
my buttons on
Yes,
purpose.
you're doing this to push my buttons. If
Mhm.
that is our thought process, like our natural bias tells us, like, you're just being naughty, you're just wanting to get under my skin, you're doing this to manipulate me.
Mhm.
If we tend to have that thought process as our natural bias, and there are parents, like some of us have it higher and some of us have it lower. But if that is a natural bias for you, then that affects how you choose to discipline, right? If I feel like my child is having a hard time versus they're giving me a hard time,
Mm.
definitely influences how I
Wait.
want to
Mhm.
choose to shape that behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the
Mhm.
next one is similar to that. It's that adult thought process. Okay. So if the adult thought process
Mhm.
is
Good
that,
words for it.
the child's behavior is what's making me be harsh. So it's their fault. If the child did
Mm.
this first, it's their fault that I had to then impose this harsh punishment. And again,
Yes.
it can be a default if that's the way, if it was always our fault as a child, and the reason the adults around us had to use harsh punishment was because we misbehaved. Um,
Yes.
again, just that likelihood of pulling that harsh tool out because the adult thought process is, well, it's their fault. It's not mine. I'm the adult. The child did
Yes.
something wrong here. If they
Mm.
wouldn't have,
Then
you
I
know,
wouldn't have.
kicked their sister, then I wouldn't have had to yell at them. And
Mhm.
so just that default of, it's the child's fault, it's not mine.
Yes. And so of course that affects how we choose to shape their behavior. Naturally.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, 2 more here.
Okay.
One, and I found this one interesting, is because I think it ties back to the other ones. If we don't feel confident in our parenting,
Mm,
we're more likely to use harsh punishment. So if we don't feel
mhm,
confident And our ability to influence our kids' behavior by trying strategies like reasoning, emotion coaching, timeout, like, if we
Mhm.
don't feel confident in those strategies, we default to harsher punishment because frankly, it's easier,
Yes.
right? Like, I don't need a skill set to know how to do that, or as much of a skill set as it takes to slow down and reason and
Mhm.
be proactive, and, that takes a lot more thought, and so, if we don't feel confident in it, we might just not do it.
And think about the support, like, if we don't have that extra
Yes.
support. So, kudos to everyone listening because we're your support, like, this is support
Yes.
for
We
you.
hope
Good
so.
job. Good job. Alright, so
Yes.
the last one, is kind of a big one, right?
Yes. Yes. It's really I mean, we talked about a child trait if a child has traits that are particularly stressful that for that parent,
Mhm.
okay, well, then you could guess maybe the corresponding parent trait is if a parent is living in high stress. Now,
Yes.
I want to honor that there are a variety like, there's a variety of stress in your parenting experience,
Mhm.
and so sometimes people are like, "Well, I mean, take care of your stress." It's like, "Okay, yeah, that would be nice," but
Mhm.
some of us have different levels of opportunities to address that, different levels of support, even, like, health conditions
Mhm.
that parents might have that can make stress living in poverty,
Yes.
their co-parenting relationships, there's all these factors, and so it's not as simple as like, "Well, you better just take care of your stress."
Yes.
Like, we know it that there's a level of privilege and opportunity involved in that, but that is a factor. When we are highly stressed, we're more likely to use that harsh punishment.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So those are heavy, right?
Mhm.
But recognizing that there are reasons behind what type of guidance and discipline we choose. We've got these
Yes.
natural default, right? We've got
Yes.
child characteristics, child traits. We have our own characteristics and traits, and they all come
Mhm.
into play when it comes to which tools we pull out of the toolbox. And the important thing is just knowing, recognizing, oh, you know what? I actually have this default. I remember that as a child, I didn't like that. And when I get stressed, I default to that.
Yes.
And then I spend a lot of time beating myself up over it. And that's what we don't want. We want you to go, I
No.
recognize it. This next time, I'm gonna choose differently. I'm gonna choose this
Yes.
instead.
I'm gonna keep trying. I'm gonna
I'm gonna
make
keep
progress.
trying. Yes.
Yes. Well, and I do think that's you make a great point of like, you're here and you're listening, and
Mhm.
that is like a huge step forward to be willing to reflect on that.
Absolutely.
Um, but I also think in addition to like, good job, you're reflecting, it's also what an opportunity we have. Like, what an opportunity we have as parents to like change the direction that things have gone. If some of us have complicated relationships with our
Mhm.
parents, and so like what an opportunity that you are willing to reflect and you can choose something different. Like, so it's not all heavy. Like, there's good news and that like
Absolutely.
you could choose a different way, and how empowering for you and for your
Mhm.
family. Like,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Okay, so we
Yes.
do have one more. So we had the child's
Yeah.
traits, the parents, default. We have one
Mhm.
more unspoken aspect or unspoken influence, and
Mhm.
that's culture. And so
Yes.
Lansford in the chapter tells us that our culture really influences what behaviors we view as desirable or undesirable. So it also can influence our culture influences what we view as normal or
Yes.
acceptable. So
It sure does.
culture is a big piece of that as well. Child
It
trait,
is.
parents traits, and culture.
Yes. Okay, and I gotta get dorky for a minute.
Okay, okay.
Not
Go
that I've
ahead.
ever done
I'm
that.
ready.
Okay, so in this chapter, yes, Lansford talks about culture and how it influences what we view as acceptable, what's normal, what we even view as like desired behavior from our kids, right? Like, oh, that's good in our culture versus, ooh, don't behave that way. So
Yeah.
those are all influences. And we live many of our listeners and the 2 of us
Yes.
live in America, and so American culture, she outlined these, like, bullets of time points in history that were significant to parenting, and I just got it like, I couldn't not share, it was way too good of a history lesson, even like, for me, and so I gotta tell other people.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I love history. Let's go for
Right?
it.
So we're gonna go 1920s, 1930s.
Okay.
Okay? This idea of behaviorism. So basically, like, the whole dog slabbering when
Mhm.
a bell rings kind of thing is behaviorism. But it's basically about punishments and rewards.
Okay.
And in the 1920s, Watson was his name, that was, like, kinda the founder of this theory, whatever, was giving advice to parents based on this idea of, like, "If I do this, you'll do that." And then that was built upon in the 1930s by Skinner, who said, "Well, punishments and rewards." Right? Like, that's how you can parent.
That's how
Use
you parent.
punishments to get your kids to stop stuff, and then use
Mhm.
rewards when they do stuff you like.
'Cause it works for
Um
pets.
Yes, because it
Yep.
worked for our dogs. But so that was in the 1920s and 30s. That was all we knew.
Alright.
That was,
That's what
like,
we knew.
all there was.
That's all that we knew. We
That's
did the
all that we
best we
knew.
could with what we knew. Yes.
Yes, okay. 1957. This is the big one, okay?
Okay. 57. Got it.
In 1957, Sears, McCobie, and Levin released a book called Patterns of Child Rearing, and really detailed the discipline techniques of white European American families in the Boston area in the 1950s. But what they found in this big study and that they published it in their book was, okay, so when parents use more control, right? When parents try to control their child's behavior,
Mhm.
that's actually not getting their kids to behave better. So when they
So
were, like,
more
asserting all their
control
power.
alright, more control and power wasn't getting the results. So they immediately went to social media in 1957 and told everyone about this, right?
Yeah.
And immediately impacted it. Yes.
Yeah, sure, that would've been nice.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, 1957. And so that book is published, huge turning point. It's the first time anyone's ever found and published this idea of, like, wait, like, trying to control our kids by corporal punishment and all this kind of stuff isn't actually making them behave better. So that's the first time it's come out, and 1957, it's not like we hopped on social media and like, "Hey, everybody, here's this
"Hey,
cool thing to learn about."
look at what we learned."
No,
No,
it takes a while for
it
that
does.
kind of information
Right.
to spread out in, 20, 30, 10 years, like,
Yeah.
it takes a while for that to come around, and even then, it's like, well, that might just be one thing, right? That was, like, counterculture, and
Yes.
so it was probably not super accepted.
And parents were still doing the best they could with what they knew at the time, right? They
Exactly,
still were doing the
exactly.
best they could with what they knew at the time. The tools they
Yes.
had. Okay.
Mhm.
Oh,
And
what
okay,
was next?
okay, well, one more, hold on.
Okay.
In the 1950s, I wanted like, the aha moment that I had,
Okay.
when we're talking about parenting and how parenting is transmitted, right? How parenting culture happens, the 1950s is not, like, so long ago in parenting.
No,
We're
it's
talking,
actually
like,
not.
maybe 1 generation ago. For some of our listeners, you might be
Mhm.
that generation,
Mhm.
right? Like, so we're talking about, like, our parents were raised or for me, our parents
Mhm.
were raised in a time when the only way to try to get your kids to behave was to try to, like, control it. Like, what would we
Correct.
call, like, the authoritarian, right? The idea of, like, we're gonna control their behavior.
Right.
That
Right.
was that wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
Okay.
Which leads right into in the 1960s, Diana Baumrind, who we reference often, right? We talk
Yep.
about authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive, but basically, right, we promote that authoritative where we're offering appropriate expectations of our kids, right? Holding them accountable for their
Mhm.
behavior. And we offer warmth and work on meeting their needs and hearing
Yes.
what they have to say. That wasn't
60s.
until the 1960s.
Okay, got it.
Okay,
Cool.
one more, because I can't stop.
Can't
I
stop,
can't
won't
stop.
stop.
Can't stop, won't stop. In 1989 was the first time, so the United Nations put together, I wanna say it right, in the 1989 United Nations Convention, they put together the rights of the child, and so they basically said, like, kids deserve to be protected from abuse, from exploitation, kids have basic rights, like, kids should have access to food, kids should have
Mm.
access to safety, right? And this was the first time, 1989. Now, I will not
Gosh.
tell you what was happening. Now, we won't
I
talk
was
about
in
my age.
college. I was in college
Okay, we'll say
learning
that.
about child development, learning that children have rights
Yes.
and
And
deserve protection.
at
Yes.
this point in history, most, not all, most of the countries involved in the United Nations have accepted some form of that.
Mhm.
But that was, again, like
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Yeah, not
Like
that
30
long
years
ago.
ago was the first time, and they were like, "Hey, you know what? Kids should have these things." You know? And so it
Yeah.
is. It's just it's wild to think about how that history and yeah, again, when we're talking parenting, like it passes through generations. So like
It
one
does.
generation ago, two
Mhm.
generations ago, how this history shapes our culture, how it shapes our parents, our grandparents, and now us and our kids.
Right.
And so I just thought that history lesson was like,
And
holy
parents were
cow.
doing the best they could with what they knew, right? And now we know
Absolutely.
different.
Yes.
Yes, and now we know different.
Yes. And that like reading through this history, I just couldn't help but think again of your usual response when someone says something like,
Oh
I
gosh.
was raised, I like my parents did that and I'm fine.
I'm fine.
I
Yeah.
want you to tell that because I think that is so relevant to
Uh,
this.
okay, yeah. So I at times my retort about, this is how it was done, behavior rewards or whatever,
Mhm.
and I'm fine. Okay. So I might say something like, okay, and that was what was known at the time. And
Yeah.
now we know differently. We have different textbooks, we have different tools, we have different research. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor, you are ill and you might be very ill, or you might just have some small malady, right? But you
Mhm.
say to the doctor, please help me get better. I want you to please help me get better. And your doctor says, okay, great. I'm going to reach back for this textbook from 1950s, and is that all right if I treat you with the methods that we have in the 1950s? And I might, frown a little
Mm,
bit. I might put my eyebrows together and I might say, but you have this computer right next to you that you could literally go search the newest research from even later than 1989, right? Even later
yeah.
than the United Nations resolution. Like, could you actually please, pull up the most recent information to treat my disease or my malady?
Yeah.
We know better, doctors, so let's do better.
Mhm.
Let's use what we knew now, and you can, please put that textbook from 1950s back on your shelf.
Yes. And that's science.
That's what we wanna do, is fill your toolbox with the new
Yes.
research. And yes, parents did the best they could with what they had at the time, and now we know differently, or
Yes.
we know better, or and we know this now.
Yes. And I think it's
Yes.
okay to say, "You know what? That there were some great things about this, and there were some things
Yes.
that weren't so great." And yes, and my parents were doing the best they knew how, and my grandparents were doing the best they knew how,
Yes.
etcetera. And that's not what I wanna do. Like, and
And
I
yes.
know more than they did then.
Mhm.
Like, that's how science works.
And I
We
know
know more.
now that my child with disabilities can stay home with me and go find a job and doesn't have to be put in an institution, right?
Yes. That would have not been the
That would
case.
not have been the case. So,
Yes.
and we can go forward. Mhm.
Yes. Yes, we wanna use the information that's available to us, and not that we always have to say, "You know what? It's new science, we must do it." But that
Yes.
it's like, "This is new information, new science. I can take that in. I can decide what I want to do with that. It's gonna help
Mhm.
me make an informed decision."
I love that.
So, yeah,
All
but it
right.
does. It all shapes
It
who
does.
we are and our culture and yeah, and it all influences how we discipline.
It
The way
does.
that our kids behave and their natural temperament, the way that we as parents have our default settings, and the way our culture shapes what we think is acceptable behavior, what kind of discipline we think is acceptable, and what's normal, right? What is everybody else doing?
What's
And
everyone else
so,
doing?
yeah, and so
Yeah.
all those things unspoken, not
Unspoken
necessarily we're all
aspects.
talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so we
Yes.
do have, well, there's one little additional piece, and I'm guessing that this season you might get a little bit of theory probably each week. So just a little theory. I'm gonna sneak it in here.
Yes.
It totally fits. So Patterson,
Yes.
Capaldi, and Bank, they discuss this idea of coercion theory. And it's a
Yes.
useful framework. And I said the word framework, so I know that Mackenzie's gonna like
I'm
this,
here
right?
for it.
Yeah. So it helps kind of look at what we're doing in terms of children's behaviors and our behaviors and how they interact and impact. And when we look at this, it's the parents and the child. Let's give an example right away. The parents and the child are in a
Yes.
store. The child asks for candy. The parent says no. The child repeats the request more forcefully. The parent says no more forcefully, right? Okay. And the temper tantrum ensues, and the parent gives in and buys the candy to avoid the scene, right?
Mhm.
Or the parent, harshly scolds or threatens physical punishment, so the child stops making the request. Coercion theory.
Mhm.
Tell me more.
Okay. So, the premise of this is that when things are stopped in the short term,
Mhm.
even if it's by a behavior we don't like, and then that behavior works, it coerce right? That behavior gets like, "Oh, okay, this is a good
Oh,
idea."
this is a good idea. That
And so
worked.
it creates a vicious cycle of so if that child throws the tantrum, right? Things escalate, child throws a tantrum and we give in, right? That's the
Okay.
classic parenting advice we get, right? Like, don't give into the
Don't
tantrum
give it, yeah, yeah.
because it can tell them in their brain, this behavior is effective.
Right, so the
But then
child
also
in that instance, the child learned, "Hey, this works, I'm gonna do it again." Right?
yes.
Okay.
Okay, and then but the same thing can happen to us as parents.
Ugh.
That if I shout when I yelled stop last
Mhm.
night, my kids stopped, okay, my brain's like, "Hey, this works."
Ooh,
And
I
so
do that again.
whether
Do
it's
that again.
right? Whether it's a positive behavior or, they called it like an aversive or like something that's not that helpful, if it works in the short term, we can get in these vicious cycles, coercive cycles, coercion theory
Mm,
of bad behavior starts reinforcing more bad behavior,
mm.
right?
And we didn't
Ah,
actually teach the child what we wanted them to do instead
exactly.
at all. Yeah. Mm.
Exactly. That the child, if I'm just yelling stop, I don't teach them if you disagree about your plate, what I think you should do. Right? When I yelled
Right.
stop, that didn't do that. And
Yes.
so I just yeah, this theory was really like fascinating to me and that it's very similar to that behavior reaction cycle that we
Mm.
reinforce and influence each other's behavior, but that idea that if this works in the short term, my brain is like, "Okay, yep, file
Yeah.
that as useful." Regardless of if it helps us meet our long-term goals,
Yeah.
right? Of like, "Well, in the future, I don't want you to have this tantrum in the store." Um, and that's hard. That's
Yes.
hard.
It is hard.
But that
It is
theory,
hard.
I was just like, "Huh, it makes sense
It
how we
does.
start doing something even unintentionally because of our default settings maybe, and
Mhm.
then it runs away and it's like, "Well, this works."
So it works.
Because it
Yelling
stopped
worked.
in the short term.
It stopped in the short term. Didn't tell him what to do in the
Mhm.
long term. Yes. So, okay,
Yes.
well, last week we gave a little activity, not homework.
Yes.
Activity, assignment, not homework, right?
Yes.
To do. So this week, let's do the same thing. And I think
Yes.
that maybe we could suggest just looking for those cycles, right? Look for that cycle of I yelled and it worked, but I actually didn't tell them what I wanted to do. Or look
Yes.
for the cycle of, ooh, that was my default because I was stressed and overwhelmed. I gotta pick a different default. Is there something I can choose and know ahead of time? Okay, when I get stressed and overwhelmed, I'm gonna grab this tool and use the
Yes.
tool that helps my child have more warmth and have more input into that. Ooh, yeah.
Yes. But yeah, and so for this week we do. That's okay, what's the strategy? We always
Yep.
wrap looking at that. The strategy is look for these cycles, look for these influences, these
Yeah.
unspoken aspects. Look for where those are this week and see if you hear any of these coming out in
Yeah.
you that you maybe didn't recognize before.
Just recognizing, just recognize them.
Mhm.
That's
Yes.
yes, a very important
That's
step.
powerful. And
It
so
is.
now we get to move into what we call our stop, breathe, talk space where we bring in our producer, Mackenzie Young. This is based on our flagship parenting strategy of stop, breathing, and talking. And she gets to
Ah,
ask us an off the cuff question.
she does.
I'm nervous this
I
week. I don't know why.
I
This
am
week
too
I'm
a
like, what is
little.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kinda nervous too. Because I have a question, and then as you were
Mhm.
just talking through, uh, literally what you were just talking through, I'm kinda like, I don't know," but so, well, you can tell me no, but,
Okay.
Ooh,
The
um,
right to
we reserve the
refuse.
right. Yes, exactly.
so I guess I'm kind of in the okay, then what
Mm,
stage. So
Mm.
you gave you gave this definition of this coercion theory of what it is. You mentioned the behavior reaction cycle, and maybe in the next coming podcast we'll talk about that, and we've talked about it a little bit in the past, but can we maybe, like, give an example of, like, what in that instance when we're recognizing that, like, "Ooh, okay, I recognize it, so then what?" Uh,
I have
maybe just a quick example or, maybe an example of the behavior reaction cycle working well, sort of a deal. So that's kinda where I'm at, like,
yes.
the
okay.
what so what's next?
Okay. You go.
Okay. So I have one.
Okay.
That was my example from last night. when I was overwhelmed and stressed and just yelled to everybody in my family to stop. Like, and it was not like a, okay, guys, let's stop. That was not what was happening. Um, okay, but so after that, I did yell stop, and in the short term, they did stop screaming, and my
Mhm.
husband did stop talking to me. But recognizing, okay, that came from a place of overwhelm and stress, and that's not
Mhm.
actually helpful, right?
Mhm.
Like, I need them to know what I need my kids to learn what to do instead of screaming at each other and crying about this plate they're fighting over. I need my husband to know, like, I feel really overwhelmed when it's really loud in here and we're trying to get things done and I can't talk with you right now.
Mhm.
So I had to repair. I
Ah.
had to repair, which we've talked about
Uh-huh.
I mean, in season 6, right?
I was
One of them.
oh
So many
gosh.
questions.
So many
See?
this
Okay.
is gonna get
Let's
harder and harder as we go on.
Google repair on our
Repair
podcast
scientific.
and yeah.
I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
it's season 6 we talked about it in
Okay.
resilience.
I think
But that
maybe.
opportunity to, like, okay, once we got seated and I was not a hot
Mhm.
mess, like, I shouldn't yell. You guys were disagreeing about something.
Mhm.
What were you disagreeing about? And
Mhm.
so we talked through that and, like, okay, I'm sorry I yelled. What could we do next time? And then, like, but I had to get out of that moment. I mean, honestly, stop, retalk. Like,
Mhm.
I need to take a moment, get regulated, and then coming back into it and, like, okay, what was happening? Why were we screaming? Why were we crying?
Yes.
But I did have to, like, own, like, okay, I shouldn't yell. Like, that's not helpful either. And it didn't make any of us feel any better, myself
Mhm.
included.
Yes.
But so repairing is like, all right, if you recognize that some of these things have influenced you and do influence you,
Mm.
then you might have to repair.
Yes. So do you want me to share an example of the behavior reaction cycle working? Do it that
Yeah.
way? Okay. That gets me out of confession, right?
Oh.
Next time, we'll have my oldest daughter pop in and see what she has to say, right? I actually so one thing I've shared before is the Trello story, right? So
Mhm.
the behavior reaction cycle and how I can make it work was my 2-year-old. I won't tell the whole story. You can go back and look at that, right? Okay. And so my 2-year-old wanted to take a toy in and she was arguing with me, 2 years old, about this toy going in.
Mhm.
And the behavior reaction cycle says the child does something, parent responds. Okay. The parent does something, the child responds, and it goes in a circle. Responds, behaves, responds, behaves, responds, behaves. So
Mhm.
what happens in that instance of the tantrum and the yelling and the tantrum and the yelling, hopping out of the behavior cycle is when you take that moment to go, oh, we're trapped in a cycle of negativity. I've got to stop the circle. I am the adult. I get to be the one to stop the circle. Okay.
Mhm.
That's my role. I have one job.
Yeah.
Stop the cycle,
Mhm.
right? And so
Yeah.
I can hop out with that stop, breathe, talk. I can hop out by repairing. I can hop out by, literally just looking at the child and saying, wow, you are really upset about this, aren't you?
Mhm.
Okay. So open that toolbox super quick, pull out all
Yes.
those sticky notes,
Okay,
right?
and you can hop out of the circle by choosing not to go with your initial reaction. By
Exactly.
separating your reaction from what you actually choose to say and do
Mhm.
is another way to hop out of that circle.
So
Absolutely.
you stop, read, talk?
One of them.
Mhm, mhm.
You stop,
And yeah,
breathe,
yeah,
and then you
yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So I am just gonna throw in, I looked it up really quickly while we were sitting here. It is season 6, episode 6, How to Repair.
Nice.
Winner,
Way to
winner.
go.
I knew. I knew.
Winner.
But I just wanted to get the exact so
Thank
people
Yeah.
can
you.
go back and find it.
Yeah.
I saw you looking down and I figured
I
you must
did
be
too.
Yeah,
I'm
doing
like,
something
yeah.
she's
important.
so
She was, like,
quick.
researching.
She's so quick. Awesome. Good
Oh,
question. I'm
yes.
a little nervous about questions this season, I have to admit.
Yes. Well,
I
and
don't
it
know
is
why.
hard. I think because it's so, like, value based, right? Like,
Yeah.
what things it's like, yeah, it's how we were raised,
Mhm.
vulnerable. Our internal thoughts, vulnerable, right?
Vulnerable.
Like,
Mhm.
and so I think, like, it feels a little bit trickier, and we don't want
It
that to be the
does.
case.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'll
Yes.
do my best to not make it too vulnerable, but,
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Well,
if I
we'll
call
try it. We'll
so
try
if
to be
I
vulnerable. We can do
call
it.
Lori's oldest daughter and have her pop in
Yeah.
on the podcast sometime, is that
Like, give us the
vulnerable
real tea here.
or
I have a comment on that story.
Oh, I love that. Awesome.
alright.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Pens.
thank you.
Yes. Okay, and as you were talking about that, Lori, that behavior reaction cycle, thinking about that like coercion theory, right? Those coercive
Mhm.
cycles we can get in, also made me think, holy cow. So coercion theory is basically behavior reaction cycle, but it's the downward spiral version.
It is the downward
It's the,
spiral
like,
version.
my behavior is not helpful, and then my reaction translates directly into behavior that's not helpful, and my child is still having a hard time.
Mhm.
It's the downward spiral version of the behavior
It
reaction
is.
cycle.
Yes, it is.
Oh, it's wild. Oh,
Ugh.
so that's what we were kinda looking at this week is this idea of, like, what are those influences that,
Mhm.
sometimes internal, sometimes unspoken, unnoticed, and so it's like, okay, let's bring some attention to them so we
Yeah,
have the opportunity to reflect, and I think there is some grace to give ourselves in learning these things of, like,
absolutely.
yeah, I didn't know this before now.
Didn't
Like
know it before, now I do now.
yeah.
Put the old textbook back on the shelf.
Yes, right? Put that
Yes.
old version of this story.
Mhm.
It's okay to say, like, "That's what I knew then, and I was doing the best I knew how."
Yes.
And, like, so I think there's grace to give ourselves in these situations of, like, realizing, "Holy cow, that's why I have a harder time with this particular child," or,
Yes.
"That's why I have a hard time with this particular behavior."
Yes.
Um, and so I just think that there's a lot of grace to give ourselves and good news, but that chance to reflect and think about,
Mhm.
"Okay, how am I gonna look at these things and be intentional with what I wanna do from here?" And so our
Exactly.
traits from our kids, our, default settings, and the culture around us and the way we were raised is also a big factor.
Yes. Alright, so what is next?
Mm.
Next
You are
week
nervous.
next week, emotions.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? We're gonna dive
Mm.
deep into the role that emotions have in our interactions with our child. Hang on, emotions coming up. Bring the
Yeah,
Kleenex, right?
it's
Nah, no,
gonna
I
be
don't know
good.
yet. I don't know
I mean,
yet. All
maybe.
right.
Sometimes I
Well,
cry.
thanks for joining us today on the Science of Parenting podcast. And remember to check out our blog posts, who are written, which are, who are, we are, she
They
is,
are.
they
The
are
blogs.
written by our teammate Barb Dunn Swanson. And then go along with each episode at thescienceofparenting.org.
Yes, please do come along with us as we tackle the ups and downs, the ins and outs, and the research and reality all around the science of parenting.
The Science of Parenting is hosted by Lori Kothals and Mackenzie Johnson, produced by Mackenzie DeYoung, with research and writing by Barbara Dunn Swanson. Send in questions and comments to parenting@iastate.edu and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or accommodation inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.